Good morning, fifth grade. We are going to start on chapter 7, lesson 5 today. We're going to go ahead and begin with our timeline, and then we'll move into the conflicts and compromises that shaped the North and the South. All right, so looking at our timeline, we have in 1850, the Compromise of 1850 is passed. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. In 1854, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. And then in 1857, we have the Dred Scott case is decided. All right, let's look at the caption of our picture here. It says Henry Clay was known for the compromises that he proposed in Congress. And so this here is a picture of Henry Clay. All right, so again, our essential question for lesson 5 is what conflicts and compromises shaped the North and South? Let's go ahead and look at the political balance in 1848. As the United States expanded westward, so too did the problem of slavery. By 1804, states north of Maryland had either abolished slavery or voted for the gradual emancipation. The states of the North did not want slavery to expand to the new territories, and the states of the South did. Senator Henry Clay came up with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. The compromise sought to maintain a balance between free and slave states. The Missouri Compromise line was drawn across the country's map, lining up with the southern border of Missouri at the latitude line of 3630, which is 36 degrees, 30 minutes. Missouri was allowed to become a slave state, but any territory north of that line was considered free. Maine, a free state, and Missouri, a slave state, entered the Union as the 23rd and 24th states. In 1836, Arkansas became a state. Since it was below the Missouri Compromise line, it allowed slavery. Michigan was allowed to join as a free state in 1837. Florida and Texas gained statehood in 1845 as slave states. They were followed by the free states Iowa in 1846 and Wisconsin in 1848. The Missouri Compromise did not solve the problem of slavery. It merely delayed the conflict between the North and the South. The peace was eventually broken by another peace, the end of the Mexican War. In 1848, the United States gained territory that included what would become Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. Much of this territory was south of the Compromise line and could become slave states. This potential imbalance added urgency to the debate about slavery. Economies of the North and the South. The system of slavery was not the only difference between the North and the South. By the mid-1800s, the two regions had developed very different economies. The states in the southern United States were agricultural. The South's main source of wealth, as in colonial times, was cash crops. By the mid-1800s, cotton had replaced tobacco as the most commonly grown crop, but large plantations still held economic and political power in the South, just as they had in the past. Plantation owners sold cotton and other goods to the North and Europe and bought manufactured goods from them. The South did little of its own manufacturing. The North was more industrialized than the South. The Northern economy was more dependent on factories which used paid labor. The pay was often very low by today's standards, but it was high enough that immigrants came to America seeking work. The North also invested more of its money in setting up transportation and communication networks by building railroads, canals, and telegraph lines. People, products, and ideas could all travel much more rapidly and easily in the North and in the South than in the South. In addition, the North had more large cities than the South did. Views on tariffs. The U.S. Constitution grants Congress the power to create taxes and similar fees. This includes tariffs, or taxes on imported goods. In 1828 and 1832, the U.S. government created controversial tariffs. Since the Northern economy relied more on manufacturing than the South did, people in the North favored tariffs on manufactured goods that were imported. A tariff would protect Northern manufacturers from European competitors. The South did very little manufacturing, but it bought many goods from Europe. These tariffs did not benefit the South. They only made products more expensive for Southerners. The Constitution states that all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. The tariffs of 1828 and 1832 applied to all states, but they helped the North more than the South. The South claimed that this made the tariffs unconstitutional. Vice President John C. Calhoun, whose home state of South Carolina was hurt by the tariffs, began to rally support for the idea of the states' rights. Supporters of states' rights believed that the state's authority should override the authority of the federal government. Calhoun convinced South Carolina to adopt the Ordinance of Nullification. This declared that the state would not pay the tariffs. The other southern states did not support South Carolina, and Congress passed the Force Bill, threatening to use the military to collect tariffs. South Carolina dropped the Ordinance of Nullification. The nullification crisis showed that the North and the South had different views of states' rights. Calhoun and other Southerners believed that this was the threat to slavery. If the North outlawed slavery for the whole country, the South would have to either obey or try to farm its own nation. So let's go ahead and take a quick look here. It says talk. How did the lifestyles and views of the Northerners and Southerners differ before the Civil War? So as we talked about, they had different views on not only slavery, but also with their economies. So in the North, there were more factories and more industrialization, meaning that they paid their workers to work in the factories. And then in the South, there was still more agriculture where they were growing things, and they still used many slaves on their plantations. Opposition to slavery. In the 18th century, many people in the North believed that slavery was morally wrong and should be ended. They were called abolitionists. The abolition movement was not strong enough to outlaw slavery when the Constitution was written, but it grew in strength over time. By 1804, every state north of Maryland had abolished slavery or approved gradual emancipation, meaning slowly letting slaves become free. In 1807, the United States made it illegal to bring any more people captured for slavery into the country. In the years leading up to the Civil War, the abolitionists became a powerful political force. Many groups united under the cause of abolition. Quakers and other religious groups opposed slavery for moral reasons. Others simply wanted to protect Northern businesses from the possibility of slavery-fueled Southern manufacturing. Many abolitionists recognized the humanity of the enslaved people. William Lloyd Garrison published the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, and in 1833 founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. It connected 2,000 smaller local anti-slavery societies. Not surprisingly, many of the most dedicated abolitionists were free or formerly enslaved African Americans. Isabella Baumfree was born into slavery in New York in the 1790s. Throughout her childhood, she was bought and sold many times, and some of her masters were very cruel. In the 1820s, she was given her freedom. She believed God was calling her to fight for abolition and women's rights, and she became a preacher and public speaker known as Sojourner Truth. Sojourner is another word for traveler. She traveled across the Midwest to tell the truth about slavery. Her story, the narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern slave, helped fund her travels. Truth was 6 feet tall, had a powerful voice, and spoke with passion. Her forceful personality brought her into contact with other abolitionist leaders. One of these was Frederick Douglass. So this picture here is Sojourner Truth as she traveled across much of the North to speak out against slavery. Frederick Douglass was also born into slavery in Maryland. The wife of one slave owner taught him to read, even though it was against state law. He eventually escaped and became an abolitionist speaker. His autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, is an American classic and one of the best historical accounts of slavery. His story convinced many people that slavery was inexcusably evil. He later began his own newspaper, the North Star. Douglass believed that simply convincing people that slavery was wrong was not enough. He urged abolitionists to enter politics to force an end to slavery through law. So here's a picture of Frederick Douglass, and we have a primary source here. Primary meaning it's coming straight from the words in the mouth of Frederick Douglass, who lived during the times. In their words, Frederick Douglass: "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." From an 1852 speech on the Declaration of Independence. So it's saying that as African Americans, they were never free on the 4th of July, which is our Independence Day. They never got their independence. So he's asking, what to the American slave is their 4th of July? They don't have one. They don't have an Independence Day. Continuing on with, another writer who influenced the abolition movement was Harriet Beecher Stowe. While living in Cincinnati, Ohio, she could see the cruelty enslaved people endured in Kentucky, just across the border. She learned about life in the slave states from escapees, friends, and her own visits. Stowe was inspired to write the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. In its first year, the novel sold more than 300,000 copies. Readers were moved by the story of an enslaved family torn apart across different plantations. The book also described other abusive treatment of enslaved people. Uncle Tom's Cabin greatly increased support in the North for abolition. All right, so we have a stop and check. So let's think. Why would writing a book and giving speeches be effective strategies for promoting the abolitionist movement? So these are people that are writing books and giving speeches and speaking out against slavery. So, why do you think that would be an effective strategy, a good strategy for promoting anti slavery or promoting the abolitionist movement? So, I'm sure many of you probably heard about the Underground Railroad. So, let's go ahead and read about the Underground Railroad. While many Americans spoke and wrote against slavery, some took more direct action. Many African Americans escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad. This was a secret network of sympathetic people who helped enslaved people find their way to freedom. However, it was neither underground nor a railroad. People called it underground because it was hidden, and it was a railroad because it was a network of lines or routes with stations or safe houses. The people who guided fugitives along the Underground Railroad were called conductors. So, again, the fugitives would be your escaped slaves trying to escape slavery. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman, and so she's pictured here. But before that, she was a passenger. So she was an escaped slave. Like many other African American abolitionists, Tubman was born into slavery. She escaped when she was about 30. After she reached the free state of Pennsylvania, she risked her freedom and life to go back into the South to help more enslaved people escape. Enslaved people would spread messages about her by singing songs with hidden meanings. Harriet Tubman worked in secret, so historians are not sure of the exact number of people she helped escape. However, it is believed that Harriet Tubman made about 13 trips back to the South and helped about 70 people escape from slavery. So again, Harriet Tubman helped many people escape to the North, many enslaved people. Let's go and take a look at this map. So it's talking about escape routes of the Underground Railroad. So escape routes went from the South through the North and eventually ended in Canada. Which routes were by land and which were by water? So let's go and take a look at some of these. So let's look at the map, and we'll take a look at the map key. So in the orange, you have slave holding regions. So these are all in orange. So those are the lands that allowed slavery. And then in the green, we have non-slave holding regions. So this is all non-slave holding. Okay. And then those yellow lines are all different routes of the Underground Railroad routes. So you can see down here, way far south, you can see several of these routes going even further south into what would be Mexico or into water routes. So a lot of these would go into the water and then either escape further south into Mexican territory or by water this way and up into Canada up here. So many of these routes, again, would travel through the non-slave states and many would end up in Canada. Adding new states and territories. The U.S. government tried to keep the country together by keeping the number of free and slave states equal. California wanted to enter as a free state, tipping the balance to 16 free versus 15 slave states. The South feared this would lead to banning slavery in the entire country. Henry Clay, the senator who came up with the Missouri Compromise, once again devised a solution: the Compromise of 1850. This compromise had complicated details. To appease anti-slavery groups, California was admitted as a free state, and although slavery would still be allowed in Washington, D.C., the slave trading became illegal there. To satisfy pro-slavery groups, meaning people that wanted slavery, the people of Utah and New Mexico territories could decide if their state would or would not allow slavery. The government also passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This act made it illegal to help runaway enslaved people in the North or South. People who helped fugitives could be fined or even put in prison. As a result, many African Americans who escaped using the Underground Railroad decided to keep going until they reached Canada. All right, so I want to go and just take a quick look at the map here that says United States 1850. So in 1850, this is what our map key would have shown. So in the green, we have the free states. So you can see California over here, and then all of the northern states here. So that would be our free states. In the yellow, orangish yellow, we have the slave states. Okay. This is what I think is super sad. Look at this itty bitty tiny little piece that is set aside for Indian Territory. I mean, the Native Americans were living all over this area, and now all of a sudden they get confined to this one small little territory set aside for Native Americans. That makes me super sad. But going on, we have territory open to slaveholding. So Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory, they got to decide if they were going to be slave or free states. And then, of course, the Orange Territory is closed to slaveholding because this is above this this line that they talked about here. That is non-slave territory, so no slavery allowed there. At first, it appeared that Senator Clay, the great compromiser, had succeeded again in preventing conflict. This peace was short-lived. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed residents of those states the chance to decide if their state would be free or if it would allow slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act caused unforeseen problems. Border ruffians, people from neighboring states, quickly moved into Kansas to give more votes to the side they supported. Some of these settlers brought weapons to try to scare away people from the other side. The territory was called Bleeding Kansas because of the violent clashes that occurred off and on over the next several years. The stage was set for an even larger conflict over slavery. And we, of course, know that that larger conflict is going to be the Civil War. So let's go ahead and look now at the map of the United States in 1854. So again, we have our free states. We have our slave states. Still have the Indian Territory. But now we have even more. So not just the Utah, New Mexico territory, we now have the Nebraska and Kansas territory that they said, hey, if you want to allow slavery, you can, you just have to vote on it. Okay? And that went right between, of course, these orange territories that do not allow slavery. So again, this is going to cause way more conflict than what they would have expected it to cause. So our stop and check here says talk. Why did letting residents choose if a state would be free or allow slavery cause problems? Well, it caused problems for several different reasons. So here's what would happen. People living, let's say, in Minnesota territory, they would move into the Nebraska territory because, remember, they didn't allow slavery. And they would say, hey, I'm living here now. Let's vote to not allow slavery. But then you might have people in the Kansas territory, for instance, and people from Missouri who have slaves come into the Kansas territory to help vote for them, saying, yeah, let's allow slavery here. So those were those border ruffians that would hop borders back and forth, say, hey, I'm living here. I'm going to vote against or for slavery, whichever side they agreed upon. So again, this would cause many problems because you don't really know if that state actually wants slavery, doesn't want slavery, and who's just going over there and voting to say one way or the other.